So, in our next episode of this collaboration between Ledger and FWB about creative custody, happy to welcome Sarah Drinkwater.
Thank you.
And Sarah, could you tell our audience, who you are, what you've been doing? I mean, I wouldn't even want to start on your resume. You have one of the longest LinkedIn pages I've ever seen. Tell us.
Very old, Ian.
All right, tell us. Yeah, I'm with you on that. Tell us who you are and where you've been.
Yeah, I'm a community builder and investor. I've just gone live with Common Magic. It's a pre-seed fund focused on products with community at their core. I'm also a passionate long-term DAO believer. I've been working in European tech for the last 15 years. I used to run a theatre company. I'm quite creative. I feel like the nice thing about the modern world is this, when I first came into tech 20 years ago, you had to define yourself in quite narrow terms. And I'm such a pluralist at heart. And I think, for someone like me, I like doing lots of things. That's why my LinkedIn is so long. You try something out, you leave, you come back. Everything's learnings.
I have an important question about your resume, which is that one of my favorite fun facts about you is that you have a master's in magic. And so I think that we can't go forward without you explaining what that means to us.
Yeah, I guess, I grew up in the 80s, and at the time it was this golden era of TV magicians. And to me, there's two kinds of magic. There's performance magic, where somebody is showing you a trick, and there's belief magic. And performance magic it's like a really honest exchange. The magician is fooling you, and you're agreeing to being fooled. And I think there are so many exchanges in modern life that are less honest than that. But belief magic, which is more interesting to me, this kind of relates to Web3 in lots of ways. It's about collective action. It's about collective delusion. It's about collective illusion. And so for my master's, it's funny. It's the first thing, Zoe, you asked me about creative custody. And the first thing I thought of was something I specialized in during my master's. So the Renaissance was this crazy time of explosive information, this crazy time of societal change. In the UK, you had a female monarch, you had working class playwrights like Shakespeare coming up. The printing press got invented. It was a bit like now. It was a bonkers time. And I specialized in this very deep cut thing called a miscellany verse. It was like the Moleskine of its day. You'd have your notebook in your bag and you'd carry it around. And if somebody was putting on Hamlet, they would bring that play to your local town and they would have one script and you would copy it down, but you'd fork it. So my Hamlet would be a blonde 45-year-old woman or whatever. And so when I think about creative custody, that phrase often implies stasis. It implies putting an artifact behind glass. But I'm really interested in things that are living and breathing, things that get improved on by successive generations, things that get improved on by different groups. And so my master's, I specialized in magic, masculinity, and Renaissance verse. But actually everything I cared about then, power, collective intelligence, gender, that's been massive themes in my whole life. So when I think about magic and belief, that really relates to what I care about now. At the time, it was like a totally wacky thing to do, especially as the first person in my family to go to university. My poor parents, they were like, please become a lawyer. And I was like, I'm not going to become a lawyer. I'm going to spend a year looking at rare books, and then I'm going to run a theatre company. And then years later, I'll make some money later on when I come into tech finally.
And I guess I read some of your pieces that you wrote about magic because I thought that was, after our first call together, I went and dug in because I was totally fascinated. Thanks. And I think that one of the things that stood out to me, and I think it goes to kind of what you were just talking about, and then also what you're working on at Common Magic, which is this I had never thought about this before, right? With this belief magic, you say that there's common knowledge, solidarity networks, and folklore. And I love that idea. And I think Dad and I talk about that so much, right? That human beings are all kind of connected to each other because we love stories, right? We love a good story. And so I think, I'd love to talk more about how you see that, those kind of three things unifying both the space of Web3, but more specifically, now that you've started this new fund, you're a new solo GP, how are you thinking about that in terms of your investment thesis, and what are you looking for? I know that's a loaded question, but I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, and it's worth noting, I'm going from being an angel investor to being a fund manager, and that, it's a different thing, right? I think as an angel, you're able to pursue things that are purely intellectually interesting. Whereas as a fund manager, you've made a commitment to a certain group that you're going to steward their money and, you're going to make good bets. And so I'm really aware right now of that transition that I'm making. But I guess when I think about companies and teams that I love, and, in the context of those three things, I love teams that have clarity of thought. They don't need to have a solution figured out, but they need to be clear to themselves and to me why they're doing what they're doing. So for me, small funds, it's kind of a totally irrational thing to do at this point in time. We're at the bottom of the market. For me, I got to a place of absolutely irrational conviction. This was my next 20 years. Like, I have a really high bar for how I spend my time. And so I could very easily be working in a cool startup or going to somebody else's fund. But I was like, oh, actually, this is the thing. This is the thing I believe in more than anything else in the world. And so my bias when I think about individuals I invest in, groups I'm part of, I want to be around people that are open-minded. I want to be around people that know themselves and can communicate really clearly. And if you look at Friends with Benefits as one example of an incredible community that's evolved a product, you know exactly who Friends with Benefits are. It's in their tone of voice. It's in the people that you meet. I mean, granted, there are differences of opinion because it's not a centralized, homogenous thing. But, if I go to like a dinner or I meet people all over the world from Friends with Benefits, I have a really clear sense of who that group is because they know who they are. And I just really lean towards groups like that. And I don't think it's Web3 only. For example, I was listening to a podcast with David Singleton from Stripe, the CTO, who's one of my LPs. And there were so many like friction logging, all these really cute, distinctive phrases that I think he must have invented, because either that or I've not heard of them before. But there's this kind of interesting linguistic shorthand for how they talk about the work they do. And I think if I look at companies I admire or movements I admire, they very often have rituals and words they use to talk about the work they do. And that to me is always just like, I always fall in love with groups that know themselves like that and have ways of ritualizing the act of building stuff together.
Yeah, and on FWB events, actually, Greg, who runs events, so I guess technically my boss, but it's a DAO, right? So who knows what he is. But they've made this amazing like living document that's a pattern language, right? Of how we want people to kind of message events and talk, like just kind of interact with the world on behalf of FWB. So that definitely resonates, and it's super nerdy, right? You want to like, it's like you're obsessively curating the way that you talk to the outside world. But yeah, no, that's super interesting.
And what I wanted to ask you, I mean, let's put those two things together: the market and then your conviction around the thesis of community, because the market is epically down. I'm with you in terms of believing that this is the moment where kind of fakes get washed out and reals come. But the question is like, and they're survived for the longer term. My question is like, how does that happen? Right. How do you see that unfolding? And so what makes what kind of community is going to, survive for the long term, and what makes a great community?
Yeah, I think, all of us belong to distinct communities in our lives, right? And I think great communities tend to know who they are and who they're not. They tend to be anchored around a shared mission, a shared belief, a shared goal. Not like if we're thinking about monetizable ecosystems around products, that's a little bit different to like a belief community or like an identity community. But to me, if I look at, so for example, Teenage Engineering, a really cool, interesting Swedish hardware company, highly distinctive, total deep cut. People who love Teenage Engineering really love Teenage Engineering. You have that kind of deep cut subculture or sub community. But then, you also have, if I'm looking at software companies in Europe, they've been powered by community. And I'm anchoring on Europe just because I'm based in London. So I looked at a lot of European companies. You've got like Miro, Monzo, Depop, So Rare, Hugging Face, Unity. Very distinct, different types of company where they're selling something a little bit different. But I think, great communities tend to have a two-way dialogue between the centralized organization that are working on this full time and the broader ecosystem that are working to use, communicate with, fork, adapt, sell. And I think particularly in DAOs, if I think about the DAOs that I'm in that kind of died out last year and the DAOs that are still going strong, it's partly based around clarity of mission, right? Like, for example, Gitcoin incredibly clear public goods funding protocol. Some of the folks that work on Gitcoin have seen multiple rises and falls. They're not going to be daunted by a certain amount of folks leaving the DAO at this point in time. That's just the cycle they've seen over time. And I think particularly for crypto and for Web3, I think there was an awful lot of overfunding that happens 18 months ago. And, I think we've not seen a lot of overfunding in the DAO landscape because I think VC in general is a bit scared of DAOs, for better and for worse. But I think ultimately every great community that I'm part of in crypto is about a certain group knitted together with a very clear set of ideals and a very clear sense of where they're going. And I think what's interesting is in this downturn, there's a lot more focus on, okay, what is the core thing we're working towards? How do we get there? If there's not going to be any outside capital or outside attention, let's think of that as a great thing, which to my mind, it actually is a lot of the time. There's nothing worse than building under a microscope. I personally would find that a bit daunting. And my happiest companies are companies that have 2 years of runway. They know very well they're not going to get the next round. I think a lot of crypto funds are kind of, stepping back at this point in time. But, you're also seeing a lot of the behavioral norms of crypto move outside of blockchain-enabled companies. Whether it's fractional ownership, like another block announced their new round today. That's a Swedish company that's around fractional ownership of music. Whether it's Spotify doing token-enabled playlists, Reddit doing, DAO-like, bank accounts for subreddits. I think we're going to see an awful lot more behaviors outside of blockchain-enabled companies that are leveraging norms that we might think of as kind of Web3 norms, I guess.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and it's interesting to think about how you'll focus then based on that. What kind of a founder is the one that you're looking for, right? Because I think that there are people who know how to build technology, and there are people who know how to build community, and they're not always the same person. Yeah. But I think to do a task like you're describing well, you kind of have to have this magic center of the Venn diagram that pulls in a number of different things. So what does that look like to you?
Yeah, I guess if I think about the founders that, I've got about 38 angel companies. And, I tend to look for, I tend to do first rounds. Like I very often back companies when there's no revenue, when there's a very emergent product, there's a very emergent community. And that could be anything from a WhatsApp that's popping, an early Discords, a GitHub. It could be like they run a bunch of dinners. It kind of varies an awful lot. And I guess what I'm looking for is, the founder needs to have access to the community they're serving. That's like table stakes. There needs to be a really clear problem they're solving for this group or with this group. I think, for example, I just did a company called Briefly that are GitHub for experimental science. It's my first bio company. And I don't pretend to deeply understand machine learning biologists, but, what they were talking about is, the three founders are themselves machine learning biologists. And in their day job, they used to work at a large UK-based bio company. In their day job, they'd be using Notion and Figma and Discord for all of their working tools. And then they'd go in the wet lab and be using paper and pen. And so what they're building is a kind of multiplayer, kind of a GitHub-like tool to help folks document experiments. And in that case, what I got excited by was really, if we think about the reputation systems that are really common in Web3, the way that you build reputation, the way that it's quite common to work across a multiplicity of, I'm such a pluralist at heart. I love to work across a variety of things at the same time. What I got excited by in this use case was, solving a very clear problem for a group they particularly had access to. They'd already spoken to 200 people in this group. They already had access to their first kind of true believers, I guess. And I think for me, it was kind of the language they used in the way that they spoke to me about what they wanted to build. I love this idea of missionaries versus mercenaries. The idea that mercenaries are folks that are just in it for the money and they want to get really rich. And that's fine. Teach their own. And then missionaries are far more focused on problem solving. They're far more focused on the intellectual satisfaction and the drive to fix the problem. And I guess I lean quite strongly towards the missionary side of things. Obviously you want to back companies that are going to become incredible winners. But at the same time, I think you get to be an incredible winner by serving a very particular need that this group has. Friends with Benefits, their version of that is, it's so hard to pull together, multidisciplinary communities across a variety of sectors. Like I still struggle with this. Like for me as I'm a really big reader and writer, and there are so few communities that really speak to all of the facets of my personality. And I think that's what those kind of groups do incredibly well, is they're saying, we will curate this group and you will come to any event and have an amazing time. And that in itself is a product. And I think when we think about products, probably our definitions there need to kind of shift. Often we think of like a software product that is sold and sold and sold, but I think some of those terms will shift over time.
Let me agree with you, and then push on it one step further.
Great.
I totally for two things. One, curation was the game that we wanted to play at Beats Music because we believe deeply in curation. I also believe that you're either a vertical or a horizontal, and there's death in the middle. So fully agree there. I think also, I agree in, I always say that there's no such thing as crypto. Crypto is a collection of communities. There's a vibrant Bitcoin community, a vibrant Ethereum community, and and then within NFTs, there's vibrant communities. And then I always the example I always come back to in my personal life is having worked at LVMH for 5 years. LVMH is a collection of maisons, and LVMH is not supposed to have meaning as an umbrella to the consumer. It's really about the brand and the collection of brands. And the way that LVMH has scaled into such a great company is to go broader, not deeper necessarily. I mean, they do grow Louis Vuitton and Sephora, but at the same time, they buy Ramova and make it a better and larger and more profitable brand. So just like strategy wise, it really speaks to me because I think fundamentally what the internet does, as Jeff Jarvis said in What Would Google Do, it moves us from a mass market to a mass of niches. And it sounds to me like your investment thesis kind of tracks along that same line. I think the thing I struggle with then is, I have friends who have fashion brands. They go out and get, investment, potentially even VC investment. But, to your point about, building a company with a gun to your head, a fashion brand doesn't scale at the same rate that a startup might. Or another way to say it is a vertical doesn't scale at the same rate that a horizontal might, right?
Yeah.
A pitchfork isn't going to scale at the same rate that Reddit does. It's not built to, it's not meant to. So how do you think of that as an investor? Because I would argue that effectively you're investing in verticals, which will, have a much longer time horizon to kind of, become who they may ultimately be.
Well, and I think the LVMH example is really interesting, right? Because, you've got 14 different maisons, and each one has a very particular look and feel. And I think
it's actually almost 100.
No, okay.
Yeah.
I just one of my companies is selling into LVMH, but selling into 14. Okay, so this is good to know. There are many more maisons to be unlocked. Yeah, I think I think a couple of things. I think firstly, and Ian, you're a master at this. I'm really interested in culture and how culture is shaped. Culture is not shaped by bankers. It's very much shaped by subcultures, frontier communities, street style. You look down the pipeline and that's where things tend to kind of move. But I guess in terms of my investing thesis, I very much invest in things that scale. And I think there's a separate conversation around what type of money suits what type of thing. Because I'm quite obsessed with, when I first began working in startups in the late noughties, we really didn't understand venture. Like, it wasn't, in Europe, there really weren't that many VC firms at the time. And so, one of my first companies sold partly because we had a lead investor that was kind of a private equity house dabbling in venture and didn't really understand what we needed to grow. And I meet lots of really interesting projects and communities where I say to them, do not take money from VC, go and find angels, because it's just a different thing. And I think, again, if you're an angel, you're investing your personal money, you're doing something that's intellectually interesting, you want to back it, you want it to win. But I think with your investor hat on, you are naturally looking for things to scale in a certain way. And I think, there have been lots of examples. Beats is one really interesting one where a sub-community is a lot bigger than you think, or the audience for a particular product is bigger than you think. I think Figma is another one where, Figma launched at a time when design was all of a sudden everything, and it turned out designers had nowhere to go. You could argue, a tool for designers, it sounds kind of small. No, actually, it's the second largest private sale of all time. And I think I'm still early in my journey as an investor, so I do not pretend to have answers yet. Like, I'm not going to know if I'm good at this for at least 5-6 more years, at least, if not longer. But I think something I keep reflecting on is how much market shift over time. how you can't say, well, there's no market for X because sometimes you don't know yet and the market will change, etc. I always think about, I worked on Google Maps for a couple of years, building out the kind of the social layer. And, at the time, Google Maps, incredible utility product, a lot of users. But at the same time, the review product wasn't that great. We knew it. We were running it. And we were seeing like Facebook Places, Foursquare, Gowalla. I basically was 24/7 paranoid somebody would take my lunch in probably quite a good way. And I think what we learned is the Maps product was just good enough that we still won. And I think it reminds me that, first of all, markets change all the time. Second of all, that often something that looks niche can be a lot bigger than you think. And third of all, that sometimes a product that is not that great can still win because it's just good enough. So that was kind of a stream of consciousness. I guess because I'm so new to this, Ian, I would love to have a better answer for you on that. I do think that, I tend to invest in companies where community is the moat across a variety of verticals. So I do everything from Web3 to developer tools to fintech to health tech. For me, really, it's about is the team incredibly strong? Is community the core engine behind it? Can I be uniquely helpful to this? Because I think, I don't want to be dumb money. Who wants to be dumb money? You want to be additive in the round. You want to be someone that actively can be a useful investor, I guess.
And use that to just look through the lens of the last year. A lot of communities were created. Probably very few of them will survive, but some will come out strong. What do you make of the landscape out there today, and what got created throughout the last bull market?
If I think about, so I'm very active in like the regen public goods space. That's just one thing to note, is that I'm not, in terms of NFTs, I was really active in crypto coven, but I wasn't active in a lot of communities there. I think to your point earlier, Ian, crypto is a series of sub communities, like even Bitcoin, there are wings in Bitcoin where it's like, you're this, you're that. And I kind of love that. I think any thriving scene needs to have an awful lot of corners in that scene. If it was very homogenous, it wouldn't be interesting. I think, what I'm seeing is a lot of folks that are kind of doubling down on their kind of core contributor role in a very particular space, but teams are getting cut. There's a lot less money. I think that makes the job harder in lots of ways. Like I'm just thinking, a year ago, I remember speaking to a founder who just raised a bumper round, not a company that I invested in, but a founder that I'm close to. His main thing was he'd raised like 15 million. He had no idea how to spend it. It was very stressful for him. And obviously, that's not 100 million, but it's still, if you're an early first-time founder, that's a lot of pressure, a lot of stress. I think for him to kind of have that message, I think in terms of communities, what's happening is a lot of people that would have left anyhow have left fast. Again, that's not a bad thing. There's always this seepage effect with communities where some folks stay, some folks go. I think a lot of the folks that have stayed for the right reasons, because they are highly aligned with the mission. They very much want to build something versus profit really fast. I think for me, the level of Discord DMs I get around things going to the moon has calmed down, which is great. I think the hardest thing has been seeing, for most of us in the space, none of my friends were affected by FTX. It just wasn't an ecosystem that many of my contacts were involved in. But I think the hardest thing has been seeing friends outside the scene who were curious about it be completely grossed out and fully off. I've had so many LPs say to me on the fundraise journey, oh, can we just go through all of your crypto investments just to make sure? And, I've invested in 4 or 5 companies in the space, all of whom are doing amazing work, technically strong, have a year's worth of runway at least, more than like 2. I would bet on all of those founders again today. But I think there's something about, to your point, Ian, around the framing of like crypto, blockchain, Web3, I think there was so much froth last year that anything that looks froth adjacent is being scrutinized by the outside world. And I think that's hard. I think for lots of folks that came in last year and it was their first experience of the market going down, I think it's scary. And anyone that's lived through a couple of tech up and down cycles before, they're like, okay, this is just part of the long-term journey. But I think that's kind of disconcerting. And I also think in general, and this is particularly on the DAO side of things, we're still quite early of building the muscle of working as collectives versus hierarchies. Like for me, having run teams in classic tech companies, something that was quite funny when I first began doing DAO contribution a couple of years back, I was working on a project with a much younger person. as equals. And he said to me after a couple of calls, he said, can I give you some feedback? You keep trying to give me orders, but that's not how this works. And I was like, yeah, because I'm so used to being the boss. It's terrible. But if he hadn't have felt confident saying that to me, I might have carried on being directive in a way that was not cool. So I think in lots of DAOs, you're building the muscle of disagreeing. You're building the muscle of being leaderless, which I think is I'm actually really excited about DAO-like structures outside of crypto native organizations. I think this is how we build more resilient societies. But I also think, to me, having the ability to practice, focus, build without having a lot of press, without having a lot of money, without having a lot of attention, I think that's a good thing. And I think some communities are meant to rise and fall fast, and that's okay. Like Constitution DAO. What happened there? That was crazy. That was only a year and a half ago.
That's true. Good point. I hadn't thought of it until you said it. And I'm so sorry. There's so many questions I want to ask you. I actually have two more. The first one is like, I'm curious to know more about why you think DAOs are kind of, like a futuristic operating model. I think that they're definitely interesting. I also think you couldn't have built Apple with a DAO. Right. Without a benevolent dictator, you wouldn't have Apple. So, and as one person said to me, DAOs have one fatal flaw: democracy.
Democracy.
So I'm curious. I'm curious. How, what specifically you think will unfold there? Because I agree, it's super interesting. I just can't personally tell where it goes yet.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think I'm not suggesting that things start as DAOs on day one, right? I'm quite a fan of the progressive decentralization model. So, to your point around Apple, there are times in organizations' lives when you need a benevolent dictator and times when you're able to decentralize a bit. Not that Apple has done this for lots of good reasons. I spent a lot of time with Filecoin a couple of years back, Protocol Labs, where they were starting this process. And I think, I think very early on in many entities, startups, projects, whatever you want to determine, you need some kind of like absolute alignment. You need there to be a small group that start this thing. But I do think over time, if I look at, particularly in the UK right now, we're at this weird place in society where there's a lot of distrust with governments. There's a lot of distrust with institutions. The institutions that we have ultimately are not fit for purpose in many ways, including universities. There are all of these anchors of society that are not particularly modern. And I think part of the challenge there is that people do not feel ownership. To your point around that famous Oscar Wilde quote around the challenge of democracy is it takes too many evenings. I think we're so used to feeling, many folks are used to feeling a lack of control in their lives. And I keep thinking, how would it feel if we had, for me, I've always loved ownership, being accountable, being part of things bigger than me. And that's, if I look at the DAOs that I'm in, particularly Gitcoin, where, they've been able to distribute a lot of money to great causes quite effectively with a very small team without traditional leadership, that's worked really well. And I think particularly the reason I've been following DeSci so closely is, there are very particular parts of society where there's real challenges around gatekeeping. And I think science funding is one of these where there's, this is part of the reason why I funded that company I mentioned earlier, the bio company, is that, right now the way you disseminate science is through peer review papers. It takes 2 years to process. Who gets to write papers? Who gets funded to do research? It's the same people. So, how do you change that? You have a more egalitarian system. Of which a DAO could be a really interesting way. I do think a challenge of DAOs is people are always like could, should, might, would. There's a lot of conditional tenses there. I guess I'm just curious. Like, I would love to see. It's really hard to experiment at kind of scale, but I keep thinking, the Zuzalu. I've got the word Zuzalu experiment happening in Montenegro right now. It's like, I want to see more cities being built. I want to see us testing out this stuff. In the Renaissance, there's a lot of tests of new societies, many of which failed. But I do think that's the hallmark of an interesting era, is that people try and build some communes. They try and live differently, for better or for worse.
Yeah, it's super interesting. I really appreciate your response, because I think you gave a lot of examples of places where a DAO could really make a big difference. And I think in free software, over the last 30 years, we've seen a lot of, projects like this, and there's so many great free software projects. And the thing that comes to mind, as you're saying it, I fully believe in Balaji's thesis that we're moving from God to state to network. And then, since in network, as we move from state to network, we as humans will have the opportunity to be a part of more than one network state. right? We will belong to multiple, and we might
Yeah.
choose to belong to one that has a benevolent dictator like Twitter, and we might choose to belong to one which is, you know, more distributed and where we have more of a vote and a choice. So I think that's a super interesting way to ponder the future. I'm sorry, Zoe, just one more question. I know you have a pile of questions too, but they're sort of linear. So that's why I was stringing them together. You mentioned Discord a couple of times. And I was curious, you know, we're talking about verticals and horizontals. You know, I'm still waiting for the better community platform, for
Same.
for
Yeah.
a wallet connected world. Is that in the purview of something you might invest in, or do you consider that outside?
Yeah, definitely. I think you know, I think all of us want a better Discord, right? I think I think spaces to go and be together are really hard. You know, I've been kind of a bit disappointed by Blue Sky. I was so excited in the first week, and then it kind of replicated Twitter for me in lots of ways. I think there are many companies trying to take on Discord, but ultimately, a lot of the time it's about being where people are. You know, this is kind of why the benevolent dictator of Twitter still is the benevolent dictators. I'm like, okay, I still want to reach a certain amount of people, and to do that, I have to be on Twitter. But I think to your point, it's about, you know, optionality. I'm confident that at some point a product will come along and it will build a critical mass of folks that are like, oh, this is better than Discord. Because I feel like the challenge of Discord is you know, the notifications, you know, it's nice to have that multiplicity of options of being in many spaces at once. But yeah, I think the wallet enablement, particularly the UI UX of that, would be greatly pleasing to me. Like, I still feel like nothing integrates effectively in Web3. I'm still feeling like I'm kind of clunking around the world trying to get stuff done. Like, I was thinking about in the heat of the craze about a year ago or whatever, I was helping my friend mint their first NFT. And I sent her this thread on Twitter of like how to mint an NFT. And she was like, there's like 14 steps here. And I was like, I know, but do it. It's going to be great. And I had to like call her and do it on the phone with her. And she's an investor. She's been in tech for 20 years. And it just made me think about the, you know, if everything new feels like a toy, and I generally think that's a fair sentiment, this doesn't feel like a toy. It feels very frictionful still. It feels like a jigsaw puzzle, perhaps.
Yeah, well, just one more comment before Zoe's question. It doesn't scare me at all. And the reason is, I remember when I always say this, I used to rip compact discs from the DOS command line. And,
Yes.
you know, now I can say, you know, hey, Siri, play James Brown. And it just happens.
Yeah.
And people get paid. And it happens. It'll work internationally. It took, you know, 20 plus years for that to become reality, but it does happen.
You know, when you were talking, Ian, I was thinking about, so I grew up in the UK and did not travel as a kid at all. And I had the opportunity of doing a year between university and school. And so I went to crazy. My teacher at school was like, hey, there's this program where you can go and teach in a school in South India. And I was like, great. And so the first plane that I ever got on was to South India for a year, which is quite mental. But at the time, I used to get a bus every Wednesday for an hour to the one internet cafe in the whole region. And often I would log on and it would take 20 minutes, you know, like that amazing sound, like the beat would drop. And I would log on there and I would have no email. It would be a whole week because none of my friends had email addresses at the time. There wasn't even spam. I would literally log into my Hotmail and there would be nothing. And there's something about that feeling, you know, when I speak to my younger friends and they're like, oh, blah, blah, blah. I'm always like, yeah, okay, you're right. It has improved so much. And yet my expectations now are like up here, right?
The thing that I think about a lot with Discord these days is like you've just seen like a huge drop in engagement across the Discord.
Yeah.
But then at FWB we have these great like in-person events that are still, you know, people really want to go to and they're well attended and it's really fun and you know the like sentiment of FWB is like still alive in those. And then, you know, my job is digital events, and a year and a half ago it was like booming. We had all kinds of like really interesting conversations going on, and now there's like, you know, frankly, like no one shows up for them, right? And so it's really interesting to me to think about, you know, in a downswing like this, how do people re-engage? And it's been fascinating to me personally because, you know, I think of it as we had this kind of like misalignment in values for like a lot of the people that fell off, I feel like. And I don't know if that's true, but that's like kind of my feeling, is that there was this like casino aspect last year, right? Where everybody
Yeah.
was speculating and coming in. And now the people that are staying are the ones that are like there for the people and not for the like potential upside. And I'm like, this isn't like necessarily even a question for you, but I'm just super curious and excited to kind of like see how this all shakes out over the next year, right? Like in the down
Yeah.
market of like who stays, and then also like without the hype, like what does that do to shift these communities, right? Because it
Yeah.
changes the value proposition, right?
Expectations
Like,
have definitely been reset.
and
Yeah.
and
And I
it
think,
goes back to kind of the beginning of FWB where it felt like an
yeah.
IRC channel, right? Where it was
But
like 10 people in an IRC
but I
channel.
but I still think that the fest is going to feel amazing, right? And actually, on that
Absolutely.
on the IRC channel, as a very heavy IRC user in the 90s, for community folks, there's this term Eternal September. So like, there was this, I think it was like September 94 or something, where like every single household in America got like an AOL CD in the post and got the internet. And every IRC channel, including mine in Gloucestershire, got flooded with new people. And all of the early people were like, this sucks. Because I think if you
I
have
remember
this,
that moment so well.
yes,
Yeah.
it was a massive, I
I'm
think,
even older than you. So,
yeah,
but
it
yeah.
was,
And by the way,
but it was a real,
Nullsoft, which was
yeah,
Winamp, we lived in
yeah,
Pound Nullsoft, which means we managed
yeah,
the company in public. Like the
yeah,
way that we communicated to each other, there were people
yeah,
in that channel that went on to become Songkick, or not Songkick,
yeah,
Last.fm, which was something else
yeah,
before, Audio
yes,
Scrobbler.
yes,
Those guys
yeah,
were in our chat. I mean, Sean Fanning,
yes.
was Napster there. I never saw you in Pound Nullsoft, Sarah. I'm surprised.
Maybe I had a secret screen name, Ian. Maybe that's it. No, I do, but I do think, like if you think about that beautiful example, you don't need a lot of people to make a scene. You need the right
Yeah.
people to make a scene. And I think, like I was thinking yesterday, the Taoist conference last year in Amsterdam in April 2022 was like very foundational for me. It's when I decided to do, like I was already very deep in DAOs at the time, but that's when I was like, okay, I'm going to do this fund. And it's because I had this one conversation with this guy who was a Friends with Benefits member. I never got his name. We were talking on the steps of a building in Amsterdam. And we were talking about like flow versus control. It was the classic kind of conversation you have at like 1 a.m. with some total stranger. And he just, it was just like a really rich conversation with somebody that doesn't know me, where we didn't want or need anything from each other. We were just having this really decent exchange. And it made me think about how, I hear you that the engagement now is down compared to last year, but I would bet the quality of the engagement is better, just in terms of folks showing up, wanting to have real conversations, wanting to kind of really be part of the scene to build this thing together, versus coming in because they've read about it in the Times or whatever. I think so much of that kind of frothy press last year was challenging because you get folks crashing in, wanting stuff immediately. And very well, like to build something great takes work on everybody. It's effort, right? You have to keep showing up. It's consistency.
Yep.
It's energy. It's all these good things.
Well, I have a totally separate track question that I want to ask, and it's absolutely selfish. So as you saw kind of before we started recording, I have an 11-month-old kid.
Yes,
Um,
congratulations.
Thank you. And so I have been, just starting to get back to work after being home with just an infant for the last 10 and a half months. And so one of the questions that I had for you was just like, how do you, because I also consider myself a pluralist. Like I have three different consulting jobs right now, and my
Yeah.
head is in a million places. And so I wanted some mom advice, like juggling having an infant and working in this crazy field of tech and investing and those kinds of things. Just an open-ended question of like, how do you balance the two? Because I'm just learning and I want
Yeah.
to learn from everyone.
I mean, look, I think the first thing is have the right partner, have the right co-parent. Like without that, everything fails. Like I think, you know, I went back to work when my son was 9 weeks old. Would not recommend that, by the way. I was living in Silicon Valley at the time, and that was kind of a norm there. And, I think my son is 4 now, and, I didn't grow up with a mum that worked. Like I didn't know any women that worked when I was a kid. And so for me, if I think about being a good parent to him, particularly, it's about me being really present when I'm with him, but him also realizing that I care about a lot. I'm not, to me, it's really important that he sees me work. I go on work trips. I travel. I have interests. I have friends. I have identity outside of being just his mum. I think being his mum is incredibly important to me, but I think, I guess it's really about just honoring the person that your child is, and when they're 4, you start to have a very clear sense of character. I thought my son was such an introvert until he began talking, and then I realized my son is incredibly high energy. He's very outdoorsy. He loves to read. He's 4.5 is a really magical age. It's so fun. And I think now he's old enough to be like, oh, you're going away again. And part of you, your heart is like, ugh. But you also have to be like, no, actually, this is important for me to do this thing. So I don't think I have any particular tips beyond have a child with the right person. Because I think to me I wouldn't have had a child unless I knew that the person I was going to have a child with would be an equal parent in that way.
Well, I
Similar
appreciate you.
question, or but slightly different. I've talked to a couple of founders of communities. One has found a safe landing for their community. The other I spoke to last night is running out of runway, and we'll go back to art and sit it out. What's your advice, for someone that got started in the frothy market? They're trying to make it, to the long term, but winter will probably be dark.
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things. I think firstly, I'm really interested in the exit to community movement, e2e.co, I want to say. I'll send you the link afterwards. But it's basically, it's a movement whereby companies can become owned by their community. So first things first, if the founder is at the end of their emotional capital, and I actually think, the first shutdown that I had in my portfolio was a founder that just ran out of emotion, didn't run out of money, had lots of user love, had lots of great partners on their platform, but just simply had reached the end of their personal runway of being able to run this company anymore. So I think first things first, it's okay if you've come to the end of your time as the founder of this company. There are all kinds of options. One of which is handing over the company to your community, which I personally think is kind of cool. But I think secondly, turn to your network. I think, for me, raising this fund at a historically bad time to raise a fund as a woman, I think I'm the first woman to raise a fund in Europe who's not been a VC before. I would not have been able to do it without my peer network or without my friends that I've gone to and been like, oh, I had a really bad day today. How's it going? So I think, in the same way that I'm guessing a lot of these founders have shown up for their friends and they've had hard times, don't be afraid to ask for what you need and seek advice and seek guidance. But I think beyond that, so many of my companies have taken a really hard look at what their organization does and said, okay, this is kind of how we could kind of, lower our burn. This is how we think about focusing on what really matters. And sometimes the answer is actually, this is not a super viable company, and that's okay. So I think the most important thing to interrogate there is, do you have the energy? If it's going to be another year of this, do you have the emotional energy for this? Because, if you don't, that's okay. And maybe it's better to kind of decide that now versus 6 months' time.
Yeah, I think the other thing that I've found in this is that there is a difference between, a CEO and an artist. And, that's why, LVMH, to come back to that again, their investment thesis is, basically surrounding creative people with operational efficiency. So, really be sure you have those people and the right people. I think in all cases, that's probably the combination. Spike Jonze told me once that for every project he has an executive producer and a creative director whom he trusts. And that's for a creative person. I was really blown away by that. It's always stuck with me, because I think it makes so much sense. It's the way Spike scales. Right. And he can live his life without, being the only guy and being the business guy and being the creative guy on every single project. He gets to lead and to delegate, and great leaders delegate.
Yeah. And I love that example. I think, because what it speaks to, and I'm a really big fan of Spike Jonze, I think what it speaks to is knowing yourself and kind of knowing what you need. Right. And I think for me, with my teeny tiny humble fund, operations is not my strongest suit. I've had to really stretch myself in that space. It's not only about hiring the right service providers, but also like building out your little board of folks around you that you can go to and be like, hey, this thing in the term sheet, is this okay? Is it not okay? And so I think, for a lot of the cultural founders, or, founders that come from unusual backgrounds, and I love founders that come from left field backgrounds. That's a particular favorite. It's about understanding, where might you need more help? where don't you want to focus your time and energy? I think it's okay as well to say out loud, in Spike's case, operations, the minute I can afford to hire somebody on that, I will, because that's not what I love. It's not what I'm good at. And I think it's okay to say out loud, I'm really great at this and I want to lean into this and step back from other stuff and accept that that's not my strong suit.
Yeah, I definitely felt that as a former founder myself. That was why I finally ran out of emotional capital, because I was still solo, and you can't keep doing it solo. It doesn't work.
Yeah, I think
you need a village. Like,
you do.
I'm not sure if you need a democracy, but I think you need a village of people. I think we'd love to ask we're asking everyone in this series a series of 3 questions. And I realized, Dad, that we messed up and didn't ask the bonus question that we asked last time. So I'm going to lead with that, which is, it's good. It's very important. What is the first concert that you ever saw?
It's a band called Sneaker Pimps. They're like, I like them. It was like 1993 or something. There actually weren't a lot of gigs that came to my hometown. So I went to see every single... I'm really into music, and basically I went to every single gig in my hometown because it was like live music. Oh my God. But I actually don't, they're not my favorite band.
They're not
they're
on
just
heavy rotation today. I remember Sneaker Pimps. No offense to Sneaker Pimps, I couldn't name a song, but I remember Sneaker Pimps.
I'm actually seeing Suede soon, who are the second band I ever saw live, and I'm a very big Suede fan still. Love Suede, great band, very much of their era.
Yeah, same era, different style.
So that's the fun question. So this series we're talking, a little bit to a lot about creative custody, and so just broadly, like, what does creative custody mean to you? You touched on it a little bit at the beginning, but just to reiterate.
Yeah, I guess I think about custody to me implies thesis in some ways, whereas actually if I look at the cultures that I love, and like I love music. I used to run a clothes shop. I'm really interested in fashion. I have a lot of friends who are artists in different ways, whether they write novels or they run theatre companies. I think creative custody means the act of, in some way, stewarding a piece of culture, evolving that piece of culture. If I think about like the way that we think about sampling in music, the way that we think about, giving a head nod to inspirations in fashion design, I guess creative custody to me means honoring what's come before by building what comes next. And, finding ways to honor our influences, I guess. I guess I would go down like a kind of copyleft route when I think about creative custody. And making sure that artists get paid, that's actually quite important to me. Like making sure that folks who do creative work full time get paid for it.
Yeah, we touched on this a bit, but this is a little more specific. We have this, to me, the internet and the IRC channels that we were on were fundamentally a revolution of information. And now we're embarking on a revolution of value. And I think there are a lot of entrepreneurs that like to be at that bleeding edge, but they don't quite know where to jump in or how to jump in. What advice would you give, to an entrepreneur, who does kind of want to move from, the world of the internet, to the world of creative custody, Web3, wallet connected apps, I prefer to call them?
Yeah, I think what you're speaking about is an evolution in thinking, right? It's about where you get your influences from. In the same way that I would not have launched a SaaS fund because SaaS funds live in this world of kind of old-fashioned value and information. And I think there's just so many shifts happening with the internet and shifts happening with how we experience things. So I guess the only advice I would give would be to open your mind, go meet people, go and talk to folks, seek unusual influences, I guess. I think in general, entrepreneurship, we get stuck with the same endless tweet threads around here are 10 AI tools you need to know. And that drives me a bit mad. It's like, that's not where I find my inspiration these days, or ever, really.
And finally, like, I think it's really fun. It's a fun thought experiment, and Dad and I talk about it all the time. But like, what are the things that are difficult to imagine today, but that will be inevitable in 20 years, right? Like that will be a part of our everyday life in 20 years.
Yeah, I think when you asked me this question, the first thing I thought of, and this is a controversial one that some of my friends hate, I don't think we're going to have countries in the same way anymore. I think we'll have transnational networks. So in the same way that I'm quite interested in city-states as a whole, I think we'll do away with the idea of citizenship by country, and we'll have far more free-floating ways of thinking about belonging.
The network state.
Yeah.
I think my fear with that, and I asked Balaji this question on a previous Ledger podcast, is I don't think the states go quietly.
I know it's true, and I think whenever the person who challenged me a lot on this when I said it over dinner once, I was like, yeah, it's a bumpy road, but I think it's worth it. I think, if you think about all of us, or at least if we're thinking about the decline of conventional institutions, something must replace those. I think there are so many things waiting in the wings to come next. And there are so many of us who are citizens of a particular country that constrains us in ways we don't want to be constrained. So I think the challenge is, how do you serve all members of society, including those that are much less fortunate? And what are the institutions that we need to set up that will do so?
I love that.
Yep.
I agree with you. I worry about the bumpiness.
Thanks.
Sarah, thank you
right?
Thank you so much for joining us. I
thank you
really
so
look
much.
forward to future conversations, and next time you make it to Paris, please give us a call.
Definitely. I would love that.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.
See you soon.
Sweet. Thank you, guys.
This content is provided for informational purposes only and is the sole expression of our opinion, and should not be relied upon as legal, business, investment, or tax advice. Do your own research. Any loss or profit is your sole responsibility. Stay safe.